My friend Kieran O'Reilly always likes to introduce me as, this is Dr. John, he has a PhD in cannabis. And that's true, I do have a PhD in cannabis. My PhD was called Marijuana Australiana, Cannabis Use, Popular Culture and the Americanisation of drugs policy in Australia. So that's what we're going to sort of look at. How did cannabis get to be made illegal in Australia? Now my PhD's been downloaded something like, well, I can tell you exactly how much, as of 2 days ago, 23,769 times. And I think the main reason for that is people are trying to understand how something as ridiculous as cannabis prohibition came about. And so that's what we'll be taking you through. Now, to begin with, cannabis in Australia was legal in the 19th and early part of the 20th century. It wasn't called marijuana, it was called cannabis indica or Indian hemp. And cannabis indica or India hemp was the name it was known by. It was one of the most popular medicines in Australia. In fact, the most popular proprietary medicine was something called Dr. J. Brown's chlorodyne. And it was a mixture of cannabis fortified with morphine. The cannabis was dissolved in chloroform, and it was the most popular pharmaceutical in the British Empire. So that was the status of cannabis pre-1938. Now, in the 1930s, this campaign of vilification of cannabis began through a man called Harry Anslinger, who was the head of the US Bureau of Narcotics. And he was interested not just in banning cannabis in the US. He ultimately, over 25 years, builds up to banning cannabis worldwide through what's called the Single Convention on Narcotic Drugs, which adds cannabis to the previous sort of drugs like morphine, heroin and cocaine. So, and to do this, he goes on this worldwide campaign, and he has this sort of bureau, like it's a small bureaucracy, which gradually, in the 60 or 70 or 80 years since, has become the huge drug law enforcement bureaucracy like this. One of my favourite poems, early poems on cannabis in Australia, is one by someone whose name I've forgotten. I always forget names. And it goes, in the blue jean days, when acid was still legal, that's 1966, we used to sell shit for $14 an ounce, and everything was cool, and the drug squad only had 3 cops. So that's where it starts off in the 1960s in New South Wales. Pot is $14 an ounce, and there are only 3 members of the drug squad. So that builds up gradually, and it builds up through this article in Smith's Weekly called New Drug That Maddens Victims. The other headlines are Plant Grows Wild in Queensland, Warning from America, and that's the first of a series of 2 campaigns. So Alison is going to read, just to, because you'll get sick of my voice, Alison's going to read some of the extracts, and you are a...
Oh, you must be down. Thank you, sir.
So you start off there.
I'll get it there.
Just read that paragraph.
You're on mic for just natural voice. Okay. A Mexican drug that drags men and women to the wildest sexual excesses has made its first appearance in Australia.
Where is it?
It distorts moral values and leads to degrading sexual extravagances. It is called marijuana. Marijuana is obtained from a plant, Cannabis sativa, that has been discovered growing wild in many of the coastal parts of Queensland. According to the article, cannabis is you.
No, don't get it. Yeah, true. There's going to be a bit of confusion like this. And she'll start doing this shit, but thank goodness.
Get that on my shows.
Anyway, according to the article Cannabis Sativa, Cannabis Sativa was growing wild in Queensland. And that's it there if you bother to read it, but you probably can't read it even at this distance, even at A2. It's sort of claimed that unless Queensland, did something about the marijuana infestation in Queensland, there'd be huge amounts, if ever the marijuana craze took hold in Australia as it had in the US. Now, the thing about this article is it's just extraordinary how many mistakes there are in it. And the first mistake is that new drug that maddens victims, because cannabis wasn't a new drug. What was new was calling it marijuana. And because of the huge furore this causes, there's lots of other sort of similar newspaper headlines in 1938 in Australia, all about, there's one called Marijuana Killer of Souls, and they all have sort of, amazing titles like that. And so this causes this causes the head of the Prime Minister's Department in Australia to write to the Director General of Health.
Occasionally, the blood-curdling noises of Smiths leads to the spot marked X. If it is true that the plant which is spreading in our midst is as naughty as charged, your department may deem it necessary to become interested.
So, and he later points out that, so there's a response to him from Dr. Cumston, who's the head of the Department of Health, and he's suitably unimpressed by this hysteria, and he tells the Prime Minister's Department this.
With reference to the front page from Smith's Weekly of the 23rd of April 1938, containing a warning from America concerning a new drug that maddens victims, obtainable from Indian hemp, and that the plant grows wild in Queensland, I have to advise that the drug has been known for decades, and the hemp plant has been under cultivation in Australia for over 50 years.
So the Prime Minister's Department get told that it isn't in fact a new drug, it's a drug that's been widely used in Australia. And that's not just the only outrageous lie in this article. The lie that the plant grows wild in Queensland gets investigated, and they discover there's no hemp growing wild in Queensland. And let's get the second. So this provokes the second Smith's Weekly article, which is drug cigarettes. G-Man warns Australia, first dope cigarettes smuggled in. And that sort of continues the furore. The first article, which I haven't got actually, has this passage which says, hemp is growing wild. It refers to the long-leafed plant, Cannabis sativa, can be found growing in all the coastal regions of Queensland. It's it's in the islands of Moreton Bay, and it's growing wild in Caloundra, which has recently become one of Brisbane's more fashionable beach resorts. So the interesting thing is it refers to Cannabis sativa as the long-leafed plant Cannabis sativa. Now, anyone familiar with cannabis, and I assume some of you are, knows that it hasn't got a long leaf. Cannabis has that sort of small hand-shaped leaf. So what they're actually referring to is another plant which is known as hemp, which is called sisal hemp, which does have a long leaf. And in cannabis hemp, you get the hemp from the fibre of the plant, whereas in other plants like sisal hemp and Formium tenax, etc., you get the hemp from the long leaf. You know, you sort of do that. So, and also when I was researching the subject, I went to the Department of Agriculture and I looked up hemp, and I found there's heaps of stuff on hemp, but none of it was on cannabis hemp. It was all on sisal hemp. And the person running the hemp experiment in Queensland was the gardener at the Prison Island in St Helena, which is in Moreton Bay, and he was a great advocate for sisal hemp, so he had it growing in Peel Island, which was a leper colony then. The various islands of Moreton Bay were used. First of all, St Helena was a prison island, Peel Island had the leper colony on it, and Stradbroke at Amy Point had the insane asylum, so that's where the rejects of Brisbane got sort of sent, you know, in Queensland. And so when they were talking about how it was growing wild in those islands, they're actually not talking about cannabis sativa at all. They're talking about sisal hemp. So, and there's just so much freaking bullshit in these articles. It's you wonder why does this happen? Because this isn't information, this is propaganda. And there's a whole theory about how that happens. It's called the propaganda model of the media, and popularised by Noam Chomsky and Edward Herman in their book Manufacturing Consent. So it's time for Alison to read something good, I think. Yeah, that's what you're going to do. This is the opening paragraph of that part.
This is when government man warns Australia. A few cigarettes containing marijuana, the drug which causes its victims to behave like raving sex maniacs, has made pathetic slaves of thousands of young Americans, and has been smoked at recent parties in Sydney.
Not Sydney.
Well, the G-man in question is this guy here, A.M. Bangs, and you can see him here with some of these cigarettes that have been smuggled in, disguised as normal cigarettes. And this is him with a bunch of Hawaiians who have recently been arrested by him. They're sort of dazed and confused from the effects of the drugs. And so this is, I think, leading up to you, Alison. This is your next reading part.
Continually, marijuana dens in Honolulu are being cracked open by raiding squads. The drugged victims are like punch-drunk fighters. They cannot be questioned for hours, sometimes days. The women sit on their cell cots, their faces and clothes ripped, trying to piece together what they did in their last orgy of lust. The men slowly come out of the stupor that gave them frenzied sexual desires and colossal physical strengths.
So I want some of that. So this isn't journalism, this is propaganda. Yet it was on, this sort of wildly inaccurate information that cannabis was banned in Australia. And it stays like that with the reputation, with the name marijuana. So instead of being called cannabis indica anymore, it's called marijuana. And it's referred to continually as the sex drug marijuana. And that's its reputation from about 1938 to 1963. Now in 1963, we have this fabulous article from a magazine called The Truths. So you must believe this. This is the fabulous Brisbane rocked by vice exposure. Marijuana seized in swoop by police on weirdos. Television personality questioned. Now, the guy here, the arresting guy, this is the marijuana weirdo, of course. You can tell by the black thing across his eyes. And this is a detective known as Glenn Patrick Hallahan. Glenn Patrick Hallahan is one of what's called the Rat Pack in Queensland. The Rat Pack in Queensland was Terry Lewis, who becomes police commissioner, Tony Murphy, who becomes head of detectives, and Glenn Hallahan, who becomes the chief investigator for Suncorp Insurance. And they've got another good friend who beats them into Parliament, a guy called... Well, so I'll show you the next one. Next billboard. The next thing we're going to do is... Which one is it? Aha, it's this one. Yeah. This is the picture of the marijuana weirdo raid. So, what's happened in the marijuana weirdo raid is it's 1963 in Brisbane. Weirdos is the term they use for gays. So there's this big party, big raid on this party, led by Hallahan, and Hallahan has his mate Ron Richards, who writes this article, and his photographer on hand, so that they can take pictures of ace detective Glenn Hallahan, which is the way Ron Richards always referred to him, as ace detective Glenn Hallahan, arresting people. This guy here, one of the arresting party, is Don Lang. He becomes a member of Parliament, and he becomes head of, I think, transport. He becomes Minister for Transport in Queensland. And another person there is a guy called Bauer, Inspector Bauer. Inspector Bauer is, later on becomes Police Commissioner in Queensland. So you can see at this party, which they're just, they've got an amazing range of top detectives, picking on this poor guy who's at a party and these other people. And the reason they're doing that is because Hallahan has been caught out by the court system in Queensland. Hallahan, the way he gets his reputation as ace detective is when he arrests you, he offers you a choice, like you can plead guilty, and if you plead guilty, he'll put in a good word with you and the judge, and you'll only get a small, £100 fine. But if you don't plead guilty, he says, he tells you he's going to load you up, and he'll, that means basically plant all this evidence on you, and instead you'll, spend a year in prison. So that's what ace detective Glenn Hallahan built his reputation on. And he gets discovered, and he's about to, there's a high court about to investigate him. So he needs a headline a day, and this is the headline that his mate Ron Richards gets him. And there's this corrupt relationship between crime journalists and corrupt police, which, so what's called, true crime in Australia is a bit of a joke. Just like my book, except I don't call it a joke. So that's what happens there, and that's what this is about. You'll notice the newspaper calls itself The Truth, and yet what it is doing is it's giving this huge lie to save a crooked policeman. So once again, it's the relationship between police and journalists which is core to villainising people as cannabis users, and also to villainising just the cannabis leaf itself. And so that's what the propaganda theory says. It says that journalists aren't there to tell you the truth. Journalists are there to tell you what powerful institutions and people want you to believe. So what is believed about marijuana, as they rename it, is what the US Department of Narcotics and the Harry Ansling wants you to believe. So that's essentially that's a really important thing about how it happens. It's a coalition between the Black Knights of the police force and the Black Knights of journalism. Like with all these things, there's a sort of bell curve, in properties. Like there's which goes from honest people to crooks, and it's probably only about the bottom 2.5% of the police force are the ones who set up the joke, and it's probably about 2.5% of police who are white knights who actually, you know, fight the joke and try and get the corrupt police kicked out of the police force. So what this leads to ultimately is, we'll do Mr. Dick, I think, is what it leads to. This is a cartoon by Ian Mole called Mr. Dick. It goes like this. Deep in the heart of the city, Dick plans a raid on a dealer of narcotics. Then you see Dick and his mate beating up somebody. Okay, we got what we need. The name, the number, and the street. Let's go. Just missing an old lady crossing it. They jump the fence and Dick points the gun at some poor guy and says, "Freeze, punk." And okay, we've found an ounce of smacking. Now you do as we say or do 3 years. Sell this by next week. We'll give you more then. Your cut is half as much as you've been getting. And as they go away, his partner says, "Boy, the boss will be happy with us." And so that's what happens because they've got these laws about cannabis which have been brought in. They then start to build the bureaucracy of the drug police, and that's so that's what happens. Now, what this leads to is that Sydney connection. Is that on the other side?
Thank you very much. Well, that's
yeah. So this is what my books are about, not just the joke, but also, I think I've got another one here. The Killer Cop and the Murder of Donald McKay. The Killer Cop and the Murder of Donald McKay is about how the drug joke in New South Wales and how it develops. And the Sydney Connection's a bit of an update which also looks at how it developed in Queensland. And essentially what happens is around about the late 1960s, the CIA take over the drug trade in the Golden Triangle where they're waging a war in the Vietnam War. Previously, when the French were organising the war in Indochina, the French connection covered the drug trade. But as the US take over it, what gets happening is the Sydney connection, which is a way of transporting drugs to San Francisco from Sydney. You first, move the drugs to Australia, and then from Australia you transship them to Sydney. And that's the sort of force that's behind it. It relies on the Nugent Hand Bank, Michael Hand and Frank Nugent. Frank's in Sydney, Michael Hand's in Singapore. What the two guys running it is Murray Riley, an ex-New South Wales detective. Murray Riley is also an Olympic champion. He wins gold medals in double sculls in 2 Commonwealth Games and a bronze medal at the Melbourne Games. And the person partnering him is another policeman called Merv Wood. Now, when Murray Riley becomes king, the king of the Sydney drug trade, Merv Wood becomes New South Wales Police Commissioner. So that's sort of what describes New South Wales for you. The fact that one of the double skull champions is the police commissioner, and the other one's the Mr. Big of organised crime. The other person they have is Bella Sadai, who's the front man for Sir Peter Abels, who has control of TNT. And they go to San Francisco, where they meet up with the San Francisco Mafia, and they get this new wonder plant, like it's a form of marijuana guaranteed to blow your head off, according to Bella Sadai. And what it is a really freaking interesting plant, because what has happened in 1971 is that a guy called Richard Evans Schultz, who's the professor, he runs the Harvard Botanic Garden, and he writes this really interesting paper called Cannabis, A Case of Taxonomic Neglect, which argues the fact that in the Western world we don't know much about cannabis because the homeland of cannabis was all in what was then the USSR. So that, basically our information on cannabis was pretty rat shit till then. And he starts arguing that, marijuana is defined in the laws as cannabis sativa. Now, cannabis sativa in botany is the European hemp plant. It's defined by Linnaeus in 1753. And around about 1790, another guy called Jean-Baptiste Lamarck, I think, he discovers Indian cannabis, and he discovers that unlike the European hemp plant, the Europeans aren't growing it, for fibre. They're growing it to use as a sort of opium-like drug. And he defines it as a separate species. So what Schultz is doing in the 1970s in America, he's appearing as a witness for the defence, saying, look, you've prosecuted this poor man for cannabis sativa, but it was actual fact cannabis indica, so you should let him go free. It's called a species defence, and it's, I tried using it unsuccessfully. So that's what's happening, and that's what he's trying to do. Is he accepts what's called the polyspecies view of cannabis, that there are a number of species, that there's this European hemp one and there's the Indian hemp one, and that they're different species. So he goes in search of the type species for cannabis indica. But what he discovers is an entirely new form of cannabis, which he incorrectly claims is then the type species for cannabis indica. Now look, he was head of the Botanic Garden at Harvard, so he kind of outranks me a bit. But, in cannabis history and cannabis botany, it's now coming to the conclusion that he was wrong, that this new species, and the interesting thing about this new species and why the San Francisco Mafia are interested in it and why they're interested in giving it to the Sydney connection, is that it's basically the origins of the skunk species. And what's important about it is that it's a very short plant, it's about 3 foot high, it only comes up to here, but it's also got a much shorter growing time. Like the old marijuana species we used to have in Australia used to mature in 9 months. You'd plant them in October, they'd start to flower around about March, and you'd harvest them in May, which is why MardiGrass happens in May, because it's a harvest festival. But this plant is different, and you can get 2 crops a year from it. So over the next couple of decades, it gets crossed with every species of cannabis indica, I think. I don't think you'd find a genuine cannabis indica plant anymore. They've all been crossed with this particular plant. Anyway, so that's how. So what the joke is about, it's about how that plant finds its way. It's about a lot of things. It sort of also mentions other things we've been mentioning, but how that finds its way to North Queensland. And whenever you see those things about cannabis, there's a cannabis sativa marijuana plant here, a cannabis indica plant there. We people who study cannabis regard that as so much freaking bullshit, because cannabis sativa is the European hemp plant. That's what it is. And cannabis indica is what marijuana used to be before it got crossed with the Afghani plant. The Afghani plant, as well as having a shorter maturity time, being shorter in height, also has a broad leaf. So the correct way to sort of classify what people call indica and sativa brands is broadleaf cannabis and narrowleaf cannabis, and really it's not the sativa. You just that's just a mistake. You shouldn't really call it that, and it infuriates people like me when I see it happening, because I know it's wrong. Okay, so how are we going for time?
11:30.
Oh, 11:30.
Yes.
Well, I should ask questions, and I'll sign some books if I think we're giving away the books, I think. So yeah, I'll sort of stop it there, and
We're going to book and we're going to sign. Come up. And any questions?
Yeah, do the questions first. Oh, well, yeah, do the questions first so I can answer them. Rather than have you sign them, Alison. I think that would be wrong. So has anyone got any questions? Are there any people who still believe that marijuana has got a sativa and indica? Because I don't.
One question.
Yeah.
When the marijuana start? When start?
When does the word marijuana start?
Yeah.
Yeah, well, normally, it's, as I said, it's called cannabis indica in the Western world ever since Lamarck, which is the 1790s.
Before the human race or after?
Well, what happens is something called the Ice Age, which breaks about 10 or 12,000 years ago. So you've got to imagine what we call the homeland of cannabis is covered by a giant ice sheet. And so there are various refugia for cannabis plants. The refugia for hemp is said to be in the Ukraine somewhere, according to a book called Cannabis, Evolution, etc. I forget it. It's by Robert Connell Clark.
Nobody is sitting on the ground and come naturally.
Yeah, so what happens after the end of the Ice Age is a huge change in plant species, where they live and where people live, etc. And it seems the hemp plant is coming originally from just north of the Black Sea, and according to Richard Connell Clark, the marijuana plant is coming from East China. I think it actually comes from Afghanistan, but you know.
Nepal, Afghanistan,
Yeah. I think that's where it's coming from. Because when you think about it, a short 3-month growing period, that's an adaptation to the fact that you're in an ice age and that you're really icy.
Which one is better, hashish or marijuana?
Well, smoke it yourself and make your own decision. I haven't smoked every brand of cannabis. I could not possibly answer that.
So when are they legalized? When are you going to be legalized in
Hang
Australia?
on, there's a question behind you.
Oh, sorry.
So,
What parts of the world did it spread to when it came out of Asia or Afghanistan?
well, to begin with, like the economic system of the West is based on slavery, and that starts to get abolished around the 1820s, 1830s, but because it's the basis of the economic system, it takes a long while for the anti-slavery system of slavery to become banned. Well, what they replace it with is what's called indentured labour, where they sign up all these Indians and Chinese, and they have to work years and years and years, and then they rip them off in various ways. So it's another real form of slave labour, but it's called indentured, and it works with the Indians. So they take the Indians with them to, well, is it Mauritius? So Mauritius has actually got its own reasonably long-based cannabis thing. They might actually have some genuine cannabis indica, actually. I should go there. There also a lot of Indian labour is used in the Panama Canal. But drug cannabis has spread around the Indian Ocean in the second millennia, from about 1000 AD to 2000 AD, and it first spreads to the Middle East, and it's sort of legal in the Middle East because they've banned alcohol, but hashish is still available, and it also finds its way into Africa, and that's another reason why Anderson is interested in banning it, because it's the drug of black Africans. So that racism thing comes in again, and what he calls marijuana is being used by black jazz singers. Like, he persecutes Billie Holiday a lot. There's a whole, I think the book, what's it called, The Scream, it goes into the persecution of Billie Holiday, and he's got a plan to sort of lock up quite a lot of jazz musicians. So when you asked it So some of it may have come from, with the slaves, from Africa to Brazil, where it's first noticed in the Americas. But then the main vector for spreading it is the Panama Canal, because that's a huge task. They've got to cut through an isthmus, you know, and it requires a lot of labour. There is quite a few who die from malaria, etc. So they want pretty cheap replaceable. So it spreads from there, and that's why it gets to Mexico, and that's why it's referred to as a Mexican drug. I think the word marijuana is a Mexican term.
When are you going to be legalized in Australia? When?
Well, it's already legalised in Canberra, apparently.
Yes, correct.
Yeah.
In Thailand too. Thailand.
Yeah.
It's legalized recently.
Yeah, in Canberra recently.
I'm
Yeah.
going to go.
Yeah.
Johnny, we've been exposing this joke for a long time. Have you had any harassment or threats against you?
Well, it's normally the white knights of the police versus the black knights of the police. So that's what happens. Like, you know, like there are attempts to kill various police officers. I'm just a journalist who talks to the white knights. So I'm lower down the list, and all the journalists who talk to the white knights are lower down the list. It's mainly a police feud, you know, black knight versus white knight, and it's sort of a journalistic thing, you know, black journalists versus white journalists, but we don't kill each other, we just sort of write how each other write is rubbish.
But they haven't tried to shut you up?
No. Yeah, various stages I've played Queensland, but that's because of my political activity. No, I suppose so, yeah. At various stages I've left Queensland and come down to northern New South Wales because Queensland was unsafe, yeah. But it wasn't because of any obvious harassment, it was just expected harassment. Yeah. Alright, so should the time to do the same? Alright, okay. No more questions?
Thank you.
Okay, alright. Well, thanks.